All right, so to wrap up our aggregate demand, aggregate supply lecture, I wanted to show you these three possible ways that the model can be shocked by changes in the economy, and hopefully that will help limit the amount of confusion. On the left-hand side is the real shock, and this is basically where we started the chapter, and a real shock is going to be something that changes your long-run aggregate supply curve. And we went through a list of things, but two of the big ones that tend to count as a real shock, something that actually shifts the long-run aggregate supply curve and changes our long-run growth. Some of the things we talked about were weather and big changes in the price of oil. So let's show what happens when we have a negative shock. We would have the long-run aggregate supply curve move to the left. And so the economy is going to have to move from its current equilibrium to this, to this new one. The new equilibrium will be where the long-run aggregate supply curve is crossing the aggregate demand curve. So it was here, and now it's going to move up here. And one of the things that's important to understand how the economy recovers from this is to see what does that mean for the long-run inflation rate. It used to be at a fairly low level relative to where it's going to be now. So the inflation will eventually, the people will realize that prices have risen. And that's the secret to how the economy adjusts. Every short-run aggregate supply curve is based on a particular level of inflation, and as people figure out that inflation has gone up, the short-run aggregate supply curve will adjust to a now higher expectation of inflation, and we will end up here at this new equilibrium. So for this economy, we started at point A. And then it looks like after we've had time to take in the higher inflation, the short-run aggregate supply curve will move to point B, and that's pretty much it for the real shock. So now we move to the aggregate demand shock, and there are going to be two different kinds of aggregate demand shocks. The aggregate demand curve, when we were deriving it and trying to explain it, is the spending curve, which means it is the money supply growth rate plus velocity shock growth rate. So one kind of aggregate demand shock is to the money growth rate and one is to the velocity. And the reason we distinguish between the two is the economy will react differently to the two different types of shocks, okay? So first we'll look at the aggregate demand the aggregate demand shock, which is caused by a change in the money supply. So let's say the money supply is increased. That's going to cause this scenario to happen. The aggregate demand will increase. Think about what the aggregate demand is capturing. It's money growth plus velocity growth. You've made the money growth bigger, so that sum is now bigger. So the aggregate demand curve is going to shift to the right. And so right away, we've had a change. We were at this original equilibrium here, and now we have moved to this one here, point B. The point we're at, point B, is not a long-run equilibrium. A long-run equilibrium always has to be where aggregate demand crosses the long-run aggregate supply curve. But we're somewhere over here where we're technically growing faster than is the solo growth rate. And the reason is what we were talking about at the end of class last time, is there's this money illusion. We are perceiving mistakenly the higher wages, the higher prices, the everything that's going on as actual real growth, and we're acting like the economy is really booming. Eventually we wise up to this and we realize that, oh no, a lot of this is just inflation. And again, just remember, the short-run aggregate supply curve is based on a particular level of inflation. It's based on the level of inflation right there, where the short-run aggregate supply curve crosses the long-run aggregate supply curve. But all of a sudden, this is actually the inflation. So we have to adjust our expectations. And as we go through that process, we're going to find that the short-run aggregate supply curve will move to the left to reflect a now higher level of inflation expectations. So this one starts at point A, moves to point B, moves to C. And then we can get to our last possible shock, which is the aggregate demand shock that's caused by a velocity change. So you can look at the list, I believe it's table 32.2, that shows various velocity type shocks, but it's going to be things like a change in government spending. It could possibly be a change in taxes because that could affect consumption and investment. It could be a change in the ability for us to import or export. Maybe something's happening in the other parts of the world, and that means all of a sudden we get this shock of, ooh, everybody's buying our stuff, or no one is buying our stuff. What is important to understand about the aggregate demand velocity shocks is they're not really sustainable. When the money supply is the growth, because that's what we're looking at, is the growth rate on this one. I'm back here. when the money supply growth rate is increased, say from 2% to 4%, the Federal Reserve, who's doing that, can continue to grow it at 4%. They don't have to give up after a year or two. The types of shocks that are happening over, I should say this, the types of shocks that are happening over here would be like an increase in government spending. We've had a recession. They decide to do a $100 billion project. But that just happened that year. The next year, they're not doing another 100 billion and another 100, and it doesn't continue to grow. So you do have an increase in the growth rate of our spending because of this shock to the velocity, but it goes away. It's not a sustained increase to our spending. So what I'm describing then, let's see here, everything here, well, we've done positive and negative shocks. So let's do a negative shock let's do a positive shock on the velocity. So we're going to have the government do some spending. They're going to boost the economy and cause aggregate demand to increase. But as I said, that's not going to be something that will continue or sustain. So at first we were at point B. After the increase in our velocity of spending caused by, as I said, an increase in government spending, we are at point B. When this increased velocity goes away, so does the shift in aggregate demand. And so we really do just shift back to where we started. So this one is going to be A to B and back where you started. What was some of the other things that shifted velocity? Let's say it was export growth. Some of the other parts of the world are doing better and they start buying a lot of our stuff, and our exports shoot up, and as far as percentage wise, they shoot up how much we actually are selling right now, and then the rest of the world kind of settles down, and the next year it's not so high. And so that's basically what we're seeing here is here's our shock where we got to sell a lot more exports, but then things return back to normal. All right, so summing up these three things, overall this is a summary, but I just want to point out that with this first one, with the real shock, what had to happen to bring us into a new equilibrium was an expectation of inflation had to change, and so it was the short-run aggregate supply curve that brought us back. Here, that part is true as well. We have the shift in the aggregate demand curve. That's what makes us realize eventually, after we go through the money illusion, that prices have risen. And again, short-run aggregate supply curve brings you back to the new equilibrium. And then the third one is the aggregate demand shock. We see here that the short-run aggregate supply curve is not playing a role. It's simply a boom to aggregate demand, and then, okay, we're back. And any of these can go in a different direction. So this here is a positive shock. I could have drawn aggregate demand having a negative shock, and then it goes back. That's what's in the PowerPoint. This one here shows, again, a positive shock to aggregate demand. Just as easily could have had a decreased aggregate demand, and then short-run aggregate supply curve would have adjusted to the now lower inflation. And also this one could be positive instead of negative. So that's not the issue. The issue is understanding the mechanics of how we get back to our equilibrium. And, of course, which factors are causing which kind of shock. So if it's something that affects our long-run solo growth rate, you're looking at a real shock. If it's something that affects our money supply, you're looking at an aggregate demand money supply shock. And if it's something other than that that shocks aggregate demand, it's going to be a velocity shock, and that's this third type. So that pretty much sums up this chapter and should hopefully have you ready to go for the in-class exercise coming up.